For the first time in 16 years, voters will choose a new district attorney for Suffolk County. Since the announcement that Dan Conley would not be running for re-election, a number of candidates have begun campaigns. Also taking shape is a public conversation about an agenda for the next DA, whether as a prosecutor for criminal charges or more broadly as an advocate for public safety and criminal justice. Among those laying the groundwork for that conversation is our guest, the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts and a former prosecutor, Rahsaan Hall. Thank you very much for being with us, Rahsaan.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
We're going to talk about those two different hats for the DA, you know, the prosecutor and the advocate for criminal justice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people understand the prosecutor to be is largely driven by what they've seen in the media on TV shows like Law and Order. Sometimes people have had a personal experience with the prosecutor, either as someone who has charged with the crime or someone who's been the victim of a crime. But the role that prosecutor has, when I was in the office, we used to say our job is to pursue justice. But in reality, I think there's this notion and this practice of pursuing tough on crime policies and practices and sending people to sentences for lengthy amounts of time. And really what's happening is there's this conversation in the midst of the conversation about mass incarceration, trying to identify ways that people can reduce incarceration. And the player in the criminal legal system that is rarely talked about is the role of prosecutor. And so that gets to that second point of someone that is committed to public safety and criminal justice.
We'll talk about how that might come into play, because I remember reading one very interesting story by Michael Jonas, who is with Commonwealth Magazine,
Right.
You know, about a young kid accused of illegal gun possession and all the context that was going on. And I guess the DA plays an important role. Do you send that kid to prison or do you give him another chance?
Right, and there's so much power in the hands of the district attorney that people rarely examine, from charging decisions to bail recommendations, sentencing recommendations, and most importantly, their role in influencing the legislature to prevent meaningful criminal law reform. And so the example that you gave, the young person charged with the possession of a firearm, there are a whole host of things that go into determining whether or not that person should be prosecuted pursuant to the law. There are some of the mindset that says the law is the law and we need to be tough on crime and that's the only way that we're going to keep the community safe. But there's a growing body of research and evidence that shows that young people who are diverted out of the system and put into community-based programs that address some of the needs that they have are less likely to show back up in the system. And that's really what hopefully the residents of Suffolk County come to realize, if they haven't already. I know many have, but also push for advocacy.
Well, talk about what I think is not just normal here, but in many cities. The DA is a partner with the police department. You know, he picks up from where the police investigators are. But the DA also has to maybe bring charges against the police if there's a wrongful use of force, too.
Right, and that's one of the biggest criticisms that there have been of district attorneys, is when there are these police-involved shootings, that they are responsible for investigating police conduct. And time after time, the DA's offices have investigated these shootings and determined that there is no wrongdoing. And so instances like these of police-involved shootings or other instances of police misconduct, as well as the other things that I mentioned from the charging decisions and the role in the legislature, are the things that we're trying to elevate with our public education campaign, What a Difference a DA Makes.
So yeah, it seems here the question is not which candidate would make the best difference, but maybe this could be about structural change too.
Absolutely, Chris. And that's really what we're trying to do through our What a Difference a DA Makes campaign, is change the conversation about the role of prosecutor. We have a website that's at dadifference.org, and there are a host of resources on that website that talk about the ways that prosecution can be done differently. It's one thing to say we want progressive, reform-minded candidates in these roles to change or to do things differently, but it's another conversation that we're trying to have about really changing the role and the structure of prosecutor. They have an immense amount of power. We're trying to limit that, and I think it's a great step in the right direction to have a prosecutor that is willing to relinquish some of that power. And we've even seen that in Philadelphia with the progressive DA that was elected, Larry Krasner, who has put into place some very sweeping reforms.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Rahsaan Hall from the American Civil Liberties Union in Massachusetts. Rahsaan, another issue that DAs and a lot of other people have to contend with is that sometimes when you get violent crime, you have a fear of retribution. Witnesses don't want to talk. There was one case very recently in Suffolk County involving a murder in Charlestown where the DA said they were stymied by that. What can a DA do to change that?
I think the role that the district attorney plays in the community to help engender trust between law enforcement and people who are victims of crime and who live in communities that suffer from these high rates of crime. And it's a long game, right? It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But the reforms that get put into place and the culture of the office that begins to change by having people who work in the DA's office ingratiating themselves into the community help to establish those lines of communication and those lines of trust. I served as a prosecutor here in Suffolk County for 8 years and met those same challenges of trying to investigate shooting cases or trying to investigate homicide cases, and people were reluctant to talk. And there's this very practical reality of some of the violence that exists on the street. But again, I feel the prosecutor's office has a very pivotal role in changing the conversation between community and law enforcement.
Talk about the other role of DAs, and I think we touched on this a little earlier, their role as leaders in policy. They don't have to be impartial about policy. Talk about how important, I mean, look at mandatory sentencing, all the DAs who didn't want to see that cut back.
Right, that's a perfect example. We just saw in, again, this national conversation around criminal law enforcement, or criminal law reform, but also what's been happening here in Massachusetts. There was a very robust, comprehensive bill that the Senate put forward, and immediately when they released their version of their proposals to reform the system, the DAs came out and criticized some of these progressive reforms that are evidence-based and shown to reduce the rates of incarceration and reduce the rates of racial disparities. And so it's a very powerful position that DAs have. And through this campaign, we at the ACLU and some of our partners like the Mass Bail Fund and the NAACP and the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization and a whole host of other organizations are really pushing to change this conversation, because we're not only trying to see change in the courtrooms, but also in the legislature and what the state of the law is.
What about the ability of the people in the public to influence what DAs do in terms of policy, and maybe even advocating for things that they haven't advocated for before? I mean, how can you convince people that it's worth the time to push for that?
Right, that's the whole point of this public education campaign that the ACLU is involved in here as well as in other cities throughout the nation. And it's really about exposing people to some of the other alternatives that exist. When we think about law enforcement, the adage comes to mind, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, we've got a full toolbox of resources, of alternatives that people can consider to how we deal with crime in our communities and how we deal with violence in our communities. But if people don't know about it, they can't ask for it. And so we use our website platform, dadifference.org, for our What a Difference a DA Makes campaign to really share that information about how it can be done differently. And then we're going to create the opportunities for the public to engage the candidates who are running for this office. We're actually going to be hosting a candidate forum or debate on June 7th at Hibernian Hall, right in the heart of Roxbury, because we're really trying to change the conversation and include those who are most directly impacted by criminal law in this.
And you also have a Court Watch event coming up.
Yes, yes. On April 8th, we're going to be doing a Court Watch training. Folks should visit our website, again, at dadifference.org, and see the events page, and it has the date, the time, and the location. But essentially, if people knew what happens in our courtrooms on a day-to-day basis, they would be appalled. And so part of what we want to do is prepare people for what they will see and help them understand the things that happen, because again, for a novice, a lot of the language and even where people are standing and what the particular roles are things that most people don't understand. And so we train people and prepare them to go into the courtrooms and make observations and collect information. A very critical partner for us in this work is the Massachusetts Bail Fund, who has done great work in working to get people out of jail who are held on low amounts of bail, because bail can be such a disruptive force in people's lives.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Rahsaan Hall from the ACLU of Massachusetts.